Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're embarking on an epic journey, not across oceans, but across a continent. Following the trail of iron horses and iron wills, we're diving into the incredible, brutal, and world-changing story of the Transcontinental Railroad. A project that aimed to stitch a divided America together with steel, steam, and a whole lot of sweat and ambition. It was a race against time, terrain, and often against human decency itself. So, before we lay down these historical tracks, take a moment to like this video and hit that subscribe button, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep explorations into the events that shaped our world. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see our global community joining us. Now, dim those lights, maybe get a fan humming softly in the background, and let's ease into tonight's monumental journey together. In the mid-1800s, America was a country divided, not just by politics, but by terrain. The East bustled with cities, factories, and ports. The West was a wild expanse of mountains, deserts, and gold fields, and between them stretched over 700 miles of unforgiving wilderness. To journey from New York to California meant weeks on a ship around Cape Horn, or months in a wagon dodging disease, bandits, and dust. But the dream was there, a railroad that would tie the country together, steel rail by steel rail, a direct line from coast to coast, unthinkable to some, inevitable to others. Visionaries believed it could unite the Republic, speed up communication, move armies, open new markets, and settle the untamed frontier. To build it, however, would require more than ambition. It would take money, labor, land, and political power. That last part came with the Civil War in 1862. While the nation was tearing itself apart, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. The law authorized two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, to start building from opposite ends of the country. The Union Pacific would head west from Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific would go east from Sacramento, California. They would meet in the middle to fuel the construction. The government offered massive land grants. For every mile of track laid, each company received up to 640 acres of public land and generous loans. The race was on, not just to unite the country, but to claim land, money, and history itself. On paper, it was a marvel of infrastructure. In reality, it was about to become one of the most grueling construction efforts in American history. Workers would blast through mountains, bridge vast plains, and brave bitter winters and scorching deserts. Thousands of immigrants and laborers would be brought in to do the work. The rewards would be monumental, but so would the human cost. And for the indigenous nations living on the land where the tracks would cut through like a scar, this was not progress. It was a warning. In 1862, the idea still sounded like a gamble. But within 7 years, two lines would meet in the Utah desert and change America forever. While the Union Pacific had the flat plains of Nebraska ahead of them, the Central Pacific faced a far more brutal challenge from the very start: the Sierra Nevada mountains. These weren't gentle hills. They were towering granite peaks prone to avalanches, snow drifts, and backbreaking terrain. And this was before dynamite was even invented. Construction began in Sacramento in 1863, but the real wall stood just 80 miles east. The Sierras were a barricade, and every mile of track laid felt like a war against nature itself. To conquer this obstacle, the Central Pacific needed labor, a lot of it. At first, they hired mostly Irish immigrants and white laborers, but many quit, unable or unwilling to face the grueling conditions. That's when the company turned to a new workforce, Chinese immigrants. By 1865, over 10,000 Chinese laborers were building the railroad, more than 80% of the Central Pacific's entire workforce. They were paid less than white workers, often lived in more dangerous conditions, and faced deep racism. But they proved indispensable, showing incredible skill, endurance, and discipline. Their work was heroic and horrific. They carved tunnels through solid rock using only hand tools and black powder. The most infamous, Tunnel No. 6, took nearly 2 years to complete. In winter, snow drifts reached 40 feet. Workers lived in camps buried beneath snow, connected by vertical shafts like chimneys. Dozens died in avalanches, explosions, and rock slides, and yet the line advanced. To speed progress, Chinese crews suspended themselves in baskets over cliffs, chipping away at stone inch by inch. When they couldn't go around a mountain, they went through it. When they couldn't level terrain, they built wooden trestles that soared above ravines. It was some of the most dangerous and underappreciated labor in American history. Few records exist of individual Chinese workers. No statues were built for them at the time. But without their hands, the transcontinental dream would have died in the Sierras. By 1867, the Central Pacific finally emerged from the mountains. What lay ahead was desert harsh, dry, and deadly, but flat. The worst was behind them. The race to the meeting point was truly on. It's hard to even fathom the conditions these workers endured, isn't it? What do you think drove them forward? All right, if this feat of human endurance and engineering is capturing your attention, please give this video a like. It helps more people connect with these incredible stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time. While the Central Pacific was battling granite and snow in the west, the Union Pacific had its own gauntlet to run. Starting from Omaha, Nebraska, the company laid track westward through the Great Plains, a land that seemed endless, flat, and deceptively simple. But the challenge wasn't the geography, it was people, politics, and power. The Union Pacific hired largely Irish immigrants, former Union soldiers, and freedmen. Many were veterans looking for steady pay after the Civil War. Crews could lay 2, sometimes even 3 miles of track in a single day. The wide open plains allowed speed, but they also exposed the workers to raids, starvation, and environmental extremes. This was indigenous land. The Pawnee, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Sioux had hunted, lived, and died on these plains for generations. And to them, the railroad was not progress. It was an invasion. The track cut directly through tribal hunting grounds. The smoke-belching engines frightened buffalo herds. Telegraph poles and surveyors disrupted sacred spaces. Tribes saw what was coming. Settlers, soldiers, fences, and displacement. Resistance was inevitable. The Lakota Sioux, under leaders like Red Cloud, fought back fiercely. They raided camps, attacked surveying teams, and tore up rails. In response, the U.S. government built forts along the route and stationed troops to guard the track. Railroad construction became a militarized operation, with track layers working under the protection of armed guards. It was a low-grade war, fought with rifles and treaties that never lasted. For the indigenous nations, the railroad represented a death sentence for their way of life. And they were right. Still, the Union Pacific pushed forward, financially backed by massive federal loans and led by men like Thomas Durant. The company laid track at breakneck speed. Crews lived in temporary towns, dubbed Hell on Wheels, which sprang up overnight and disappeared just as fast. Gambling, whiskey, and violence followed the workers like a dust storm. By 1867, Union Pacific had reached Cheyenne and was headed into Wyoming. The mountains loomed in the distance, but the real mountain they were climbing was political. How do you unite a nation when you're laying rails over the bones of another for the Union Pacific? The answer was simple. Lay the track. Don't look back. The story of the Transcontinental Railroad is often told with golden spikes and great men in top hats, but the real story, it's soaked in sweat, muscle, and pain, much of it provided by men whose names were never recorded, whose graves were never marked, and whose stories were buried beneath the tracks they built. On the Central Pacific, it was the Chinese laborers who did the impossible. Nearly 15,000 of them, most hailing from Guangdong province, endured freezing temperatures, deadly explosions, and racial hostility while tunneling through the Sierra Nevada. They earned less than white workers, received no recognition, and were often housed in separate, inferior camps, but they persisted. Quietly, skillfully, and relentlessly, despite being called weak and unfit by early skeptics. The Chinese crews soon proved to be the most reliable workforce on the railroad. They blasted rock, laid rail, built trestles, and cooked their own food, often staying healthier than their counterparts. Yet, when the last spike was driven at Promontory Point, none of them were invited to the celebration photo. Meanwhile, on the Union Pacific, Irish immigrants made up a large portion of the workforce. Many had survived famine and war, only to face new dangers on the plains. They fought off raids, laid track at incredible speed, and drank themselves to sleep in rickety tents. Their lives were hard, but their labor was essential. Former enslaved African Americans also worked the rails, some hired as freedmen seeking better lives. Their contributions, like those of the Chinese and Irish, went largely uncredited. Laborers of color were exploited, but indispensable. This was a multinational workforce, building a nation with bare hands and broken backs. And then there were the cooks, blacksmiths, teamsters, and supply haulers, each playing a role in keeping the great machine of progress moving forward. None of them were executives, but without them, there'd be no golden spike. In the grand American myth, we tend to spotlight the visionaries and tycoons, but railroads weren't laid by dreams alone. They were laid by calloused hands, underpaid men, and marginalized workers, people who bent history with no guarantee they'd be remembered. They didn't build the railroad for glory. They built it to survive. By the late 1860s, the two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, were no longer just building tracks. They were locked in a frenzied competition, each racing toward an invisible meeting point somewhere in the Utah Territory. But this wasn't a gentleman's agreement. It was a war for land, money, and prestige. Why the urgency? Because of the way the government subsidies worked. For every mile of track completed, each company received federal land grants and hefty loans. The more track you built, the more profit you claimed. So naturally, both sides tried to outbuild the other, even laying parallel tracks in opposite directions, knowing full well that only one set would be used. It became absurd. Crews worked at breakneck speed. The Central Pacific, fresh off their victory over the Sierra Nevada, now blasted through the Nevada and Utah deserts. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific crossed rivers and high plains, skirting the edge of the Rocky Mountains. They even began laying track through areas they knew the government would eventually declare wasteful, just to secure funding. Work intensified to near-manic levels. The Central Pacific's Chinese crews set a world record in April 1869, 10 miles of track laid in a single day, a feat unmatched even today. They accomplished this using synchronized teams, rotating shifts, and a rhythm honed through years of labor. Union Pacific crews, not to be outdone, pushed hard from the east despite ongoing labor strikes, supply issues, and mismanagement from their financier, Thomas Durant, who was more interested in stock manipulation than railroad engineering. The two tracks finally neared each other at Promontory Summit in present-day Utah. Surveyors marked the site. Arrangements were made for a formal ceremony. Locomotives from both companies, Central Pacific's Jupiter and Union Pacific's No. 119, were brought face to face. Cowcatcher to cowcatcher. Executives prepared speeches. A special golden spike was commissioned. Telegraph wires were hooked up to transmit the final hammer blows in real time across the country. But behind the celebration was the lingering reality. The race had been brutal, often reckless, and entirely driven by profit. The rails were now joined, but the scars they left behind on land, labour, and lives would remain for generations. Progress had a finish line, and both companies were willing to trample over anything to cross it. On May 10th, 1869, the windswept plains of Promontory Summit, Utah, became the center of the American universe. A crowd of workers, officials, journalists, and railroad executives gathered to witness the momentous event. The joining of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Two gleaming locomotives stood nose to nose on the finished track. The Central Pacific's Jupiter and the Union Pacific's No. 119. Between them lay a final rail, and at its center, a golden spike engraved with the words, "May God continue the unity of our country." As this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world, telegraph lines had been connected to the ceremonial hammer. Each blow would send an electric signal across the country. As Leland Stanford, representing the Central Pacific, raised the sledgehammer, Americans across the nation leaned in to listen. With each swing, the telegraph clicked. Done. Church bells rang. Cannons fired. Cities erupted in celebration. From New York to San Francisco, it was as if a national artery had been stitched together in real time. The East and West were no longer months apart. They were 7 days apart by rail. It was a stunning engineering achievement. The United States was now bound coast to coast by steel and steam. The symbolic significance couldn't be overstated. A young post-Civil War nation had proven it could connect its fractured parts and march into a modern industrial era. But not everyone was part of the celebration. None of the Chinese workers who had laid most of the Central Pacific's track were invited to the photo. They had been excluded from the ceremony entirely. Despite their role in accomplishing the impossible, the Irish labourers, freedmen, native guides and other marginalised workers were also absent from the frame. In their place stood bearded men in frock coats, holding hammers and cigars. So while the country celebrated unity, the reality was more complex. The railroad did connect east to west, but it also sharpened divisions between races, classes and cultures. It united markets, but at the cost of many human lives. The photo that day captured the official story of the railroad, but the real story, that was buried beneath the track. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad didn't just shrink geography, it exploded the American economy. Almost overnight, the United States was no longer a bicoastal nation, awkwardly bridged by wilderness. It was now a single economic organism, pulsing with movement, commerce and opportunity. Goods that once took months to transport by wagon or ship could now move from coast to coast in under a week. Agricultural products from the Midwest, wheat, corn, cattle, could be shipped westward to booming mining towns or eastward to the industrial cities. Manufactured goods flowed in the opposite direction. Railcars replaced oxen. Steam replaced sail. What had once been an uncertain frontier was now a profitable supply chain. Towns sprouted like weeds along the railroad towns that grew up almost overnight. Some became cities, others disappeared as quickly as they came, especially if the rail line shifted. But each one was a node in a growing network, connected by a steady rhythm of pistons, whistles and smoke. The railroad also helped fuel industrial growth. Ironworks, coal mines, timber mills all surged with demand. The need for rails, locomotives, and infrastructure created jobs across the nation. Steel barons and railroad tycoons got rich. Bankers lined their pockets, and small-time entrepreneurs rode the wave, opening hotels, restaurants, and general stores along the line. Mail moved faster. News traveled across time zones in days instead of weeks. For the first time, the government could project real presence across the full continent, deploying troops, resources, and political influence wherever the rails reached. And let's not forget the human factor. Millions of people moved west. Immigrants from Europe who once landed in New York now saw a direct path to land and labor in California, Oregon, and the Western Territories. Homesteaders, prospectors, ranchers, and outlaws all rode the same steel road toward destiny. Of course, this boom wasn't evenly shared. Wealth flowed upward. Native lands were devoured. Laborers remained poor. But there's no denying it. The railroad transformed the US from a regional republic into a continental power. The engine wasn't just moving people, it was moving money, power, and the future. And once it started, it wasn't going to stop. Beneath the polished steel and triumphant headlines of the Transcontinental Railroad lay a darker, more tragic legacy. The destruction of indigenous lands, lives, and cultures. The railroad didn't just connect east and west. It sliced through native homelands, carving out routes through territories held by the Lakota, Cheyenne, Shoshone, Ute, and many others. What had once been open plains and sacred ground was now divided by rails, telegraph poles, and fencing. With each spike driven, native sovereignty was eroded. The impact was immediate and brutal. Buffalo herds, central to Plains tribes' economies, diets, and spirituality, were slaughtered en masse to clear the way for trains and settlers. In some cases, passengers were encouraged to shoot buffalo for sport from moving trains. These herds, once numbering in the tens of millions, dwindled to near extinction in just a few decades. The railroad brought more than tracks. It brought settlers, soldiers, and surveyors. Towns popped up where there had been none. Homesteaders, empowered by the federal government, staked claims on tribal lands. What treaties hadn't taken, the railroad now absorbed, and with settlers came enforcement. Military garrisons sent to protect the tracks and suppress any resistance. Conflicts erupted. The Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other tribes fought back in what became a series of bloody wars, some labelled uprisings, others outright massacres. From Red Cloud's War to the Battle of Little Bighorn, the railroads were both the battleground and the prize. Eventually, resistance was crushed. Indigenous nations were confined to reservations, often hundreds of miles from their ancestral lands. The psychological toll was immense. Sacred sites were desecrated. Hunting patterns were broken. Nomadic cultures, built around seasonal migration and vast open space, were forced into fixed locations under constant surveillance, and all of it was justified in the name of progress. The Transcontinental Railroad was hailed as a marvel of American ingenuity, but it came at the cost of 1,000 nations' dreams. It wasn't just the iron that cut through the land, it was the erasure of a way of life. Replaced by timetables and timbers. History books often praise the railroad for uniting a nation, but for native peoples, it tore theirs apart. When the final spike was driven at Promontory Summit in 1869, it wasn't just the end of a railroad. It was the beginning of a new American identity, faster, hungrier, and increasingly shaped by steel and steam. The Transcontinental Railroad shrank the country. What had once taken 6 months by wagon or ship now took 7 days by rail. It changed how people moved, how goods were exchanged, and how the very idea of distance was understood. Suddenly, The concept of a coast-to-coast nation wasn't a dream. It was a daily reality. The railroad fueled the rise of time zones, created to coordinate cross-country travel and commerce. It reorganized agriculture, allowing farmers to send produce across state lines. It powered the second industrial revolution, enabling raw materials to flow efficiently into urban factories. The rhythm of the country began to match the clatter of trains. Culturally, the railroad reinforced a sense of manifest destiny, the belief that America was meant to span from Atlantic to Pacific. It made expansion feel not just possible, but inevitable. With rails stretching across deserts, mountains, and plains, there was no longer a wild frontier. Everything felt reachable, everything felt claimable. But the railroad also set the template for corporate power in America. Massive wealth accumulated at the top. Men like Leland Stanford, Thomas Durant, and Collis Huntington didn't just get rich. They shaped policy, bought politicians, and built empires. Corruption scandals like the Credit Mobilier affair exposed how deeply railroad interests were embedded in government. For laborers, the train tracks marked both opportunity and exploitation. For indigenous peoples, it marked the end of a world. For the environment, it brought radical change. Forests cleared, rivers bridged, buffalo nearly exterminated. Yet, for all its costs, the railroad undeniably stitched the fabric of a modern America. It connected immigrants to opportunity, businesses to markets, and governments to distant territories. It transformed an experimental republic into a fully integrated nation. The iron rails didn't just carry passengers, they carried ambition, destruction, hope, and hubris. The railroad was both a triumph and a tragedy, and once those twin locomotives touched cowcatchers in the Utah desert, the country was never the same again. The nation was transformed, not by war or election, but by iron and fire. What a monumental undertaking. With such a complex and far-reaching legacy, when you think about the Transcontinental Railroad, what stands out to you the most? The incredible engineering, the human cost, or its undeniable impact on shaping America? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this journey along the iron rails of history. If this story of ambition and transformation resonated with you, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you don't miss our next exploration into the events that defined our world. Until then, keep learning and stay curious.